One day since Frank Ragnow's retirement, today we're going to be looking at a few different free agent options the Lions could potentially target that are still available to add some depth to this offensive line. So let's get right into it. So today, a day away from Frank Ragnow's retirement, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk through a few different names. We won't spend a ton of time on each player here, but just give a slight little background on different players that are available for the Lions in free agency as of now that they could potentially look to target to either one, just add depth, add competition throughout the offseason, ranging all the way up to potentially looking at a guy that they feel like could come in and help them right away. Now, there's not many of those options available on the market. The most notable being a guy like Brandon Sheriff. He's 33 and a half years old, but he's also a player that we've already done a video on, so I won't spend that much time on Brandon Sheriff here, but of course I like him. I think he's the best interior offensive lineman available. When we're talking about the interior offensive line since Frank has retired, I do believe this could range from a center to a guard, a guy that's shown flexibility, guys that maybe haven't shown a ton of flexibility, whether that's more of the competition mold on a cheaper deal, all the way up to you believe that this guy could actually help you on game day, so you're going to pay him a little bit extra, because since Frank has retired, the Lions have gained a little bit of cap space. And according to SpotTrack, these numbers won't be exact, but according to SpotTrack right now, all they're essentially counting him for is the $3.6 million options that he has this year and next year, as well as this season, the $1.2 million signing bonus. Could ask for back, but I don't think that's going to happen. I would assume it doesn't happen. So that means that he has a $4.8 million cap hit this year and $3.6 million next season, essentially, that he's getting counted for, as he's essentially being looked at as a guy that was waived. That's how it's being calculated by SpotTrack. I would assume that would just accelerate because the guy did retire, that would just accelerate all into that first year, so you actually open up less money. However, the reason I believe that $3.6 million option would not actually accelerate, and I believe this, is because he's retired. So technically speaking, if he decided to come back next season, then he would have that $3.6 million. So it won't accelerate because he could potentially actually unretire, even though maybe we don't think that's going to happen. He could, but that would still mean opening up more money for next year. So I don't think that's that important as of now, because the Lions have plenty of cap space, but they are opening up more cap space. So when they tell us that they can't afford guys like Zadarius Smith, now they may have more flexibility to do something like that in the short term. Or again, they could look to still roll a majority of this over into next year, assuming again they're meeting that threshold of the amount that they have to pay within that 4-year span. As long as they're meeting that threshold, then this does clearly open up some good cap space for the Lions. So I'm assuming they're going to want to continue to push some of this money forward, but this game may give them a little bit more wiggle room. Now, I don't anticipate they're going to go out and make big splash moves now that Frank Ragnow has retired, but I could see them definitely adding some depth on this offensive line. I do expect that's going to happen, but by the numbers, with that being the case, that would roughly, I believe, mean the Lions in the SpotTrack has them opening up about $9.25 million in cap space this year and about $11.75 million next season, with those two cap hits in play, minus the cap hit that he was already set to have for the Lions over the next 2 seasons, minus what that money is. And that's also now including the Tyleik Williams deal, which is set at $2.9 million cap hit for this season, but you kind of subtract the 1.1 from that because you have a guy that drops out of the top 51, and that puts you about $1.8 million, which as a whole would put the Lions, according to SpotTrack, at a cap space number at about $48 million in cap spaces. It was about $40 million before this move happened. So that's the number that we're looking at roughly for the Lions right now in terms of cap space. But again, even with $40 million, they essentially told us that we couldn't afford a Zadarius Smith. So they're trying to push a lot of this money forward, but this now could give them a little bit of flexibility to go make some sort of move if they wanted to. And yes, I'll address it right away. Zadarius Smith, I do believe it's much more possible now than it was before Frank Ragnow retired. Before Frank retired, I didn't think a deal would get done. I thought the Lions were going to have a number that they were willing to pay, but I didn't think it would ever align to the point where, hey, Zadarius is willing to take this number and they're going to have this reunion. I didn't think it was going to happen. But now that this has went down, I do think there's a much better chance that a player like Zadarius Smith could find common ground with the Lions, and that they could get a look to get a deal done with a player like that more aggressively than it was before. That being said, though, again, I don't think they're going to aggressively go over the top and be like, all right, now we're willing to spend all that money that we opened up for Frank Ragnow. I don't think it's going to be something like that. And I still think with a guy like Zadarius, it would only be a 1-year deal. So that would still have to align as well. But there are multiple interior offensive line options the Lions could look to add just for depth purposes. Some I like more than others. But a few of the guys that really caught my eye, and I'll throw some honorable mentions at the end, that from watching, I didn't include every player here, but the players that did catch my eye when watching through, let's get right into it in no particular order. Let's start with Philadelphia, because they have 2 players that I do like. They have Jack Driscoll, who's played tackle and guard, and they also have Nick Gates. We'll start with Nick Gates first, who is more so a center at 29 years old. He was signed by Philadelphia this past season. Guard positions going back to the preseason. He also played the center position. Now, he had a groin injury before the Super Bowl, which knocked him out for the end of the season, but Nick Gates lining at that center position was mainly when I watched him this past year. And he was a guy that definitely caught my eye as someone that feels like he'd be more so on a minimum type of deal, but could potentially come in and just add some competition to a spot right now that's made up of Kingsley Eguakon and a Michael Neese specifically at that backup center role, and maybe a little bit of Colby Sorstel as well. This is a player to me that showed that he had really strong grip, shot his hands. He also didn't wear gloves, which was kind of interesting, but he's also snapping the ball, so I guess that makes some sense. He showed some lateral quickness when getting off the ball. He had the feet to kind of drive blocks and find a little bit of sustain there as well. He was really quick working into his pass sets. He looked pretty natural, settled in at the center position where things happened very fast. He had wide active footwork. He was a pretty smooth puller as just a movement piece. And I thought that he had adequate juice to get up to the second level and go find linebackers. Now, he was a little more flimsy. He wasn't as wide cut. He was a little more flimsy as a blocker. He also, to me, would tend to get a little bit over aggressive when attacking guys in pass protection. His base could also get jolted. He wasn't overly powerful or stout at the point of attack. And he also had a knock to me of his feet would stall in pass sets as well, which would get him in some trouble, as well as some wide hands. But he was a guy that I looked at as, okay, this could be a much cheaper option. You bring him in with the veteran experience and some flexibility here where you can compete at some different spots for, training camp. At this point, I don't think it would cost a ton of money for the Lions to bring a player like that in. Speaking of that, let's go to a guy like Tristan Cohen. I was never incredibly high on Tristan Cohen, but I always like the idea of this. And this really goes back to, when the Lions lost Evan Brown and his flexibility that he could bring. I always liked his body type for an interior offensive line position. He looks like a true guard. That's kind of the way that he's just built. And in the preseason this past year, we saw him play at center. In a regular season, we mainly kind of saw him stick at right guard, which has kind of been his spot. At 27 years old, this is a very stoutly built interior offensive lineman that just has the frame of a guard. He's got a finishing strain to his game. He plays with some grittiness. To me, he's a much better positional blocker. I do think that's his game, is he's going to find angles, get positions, kind of seal off blocks. His second level angles kind of showcase that as well. He's pretty strong within his hips to kind of latch blocks, and he has a activeness with his hand usage. You'll see him try to create a little bit of a chop down. Now, to me, his footwork was a little bit heavy, which limited some of the versatility that I think he has in terms of run scheme a little bit. He also didn't show a ton of quickness as a puller. He felt very heavy when he was trying to move around as a puller, which kind of limited some of the movement there. He's not a very agile blocker either. And to me, the quickness creating depth was a little bit of a problem, especially when at center, quickness creating depth could be a problem there. I think he's more so of a guard at this point, and his pin down blocks tend to be a little bit less effective, lacking some of that agility. I think he's more so of a guard at this point. He's young. He's played multiple different spots. He's had some success, but he's also going to have some real limitations attached to it. So again, cheaper free agent option for the Lions, but I think they would dial him in at the right guard spot, which could be valuable because then opens up more flexibility for Graham Glasgow. Now, Graham Glasgow played only 3 games within the Lions era as the center coming into the game. Only 3 games has he done that with the Lions over the past 2 seasons. And because before that, he was with the Denver Broncos. And 2 of those games were 2 seasons ago. Last season, he only played in 1 game, and that was against Seattle, where the ball was out relatively quickly in that game. He did pretty well against Seattle, allowed 0 pressures. The year before was a little bit more inconsistent, I would say, at center. And even going back to Denver, he was more inconsistent at center during the second half of the year when he took that over in 2022. Go up to a potential more expensive option, but this is a player that plays, I think, some similarities here to a guy that we just talked about in Tristan Cohen, and that's going to be Shaq Mason at 31 years old. Another guy that I think has got really fit for the guard position specifically. He, to me, is an excellent build for a guard. I do like the zone entry angles that he does play with. He plays with some quickness in his first step. The way that he gets off the ball is very noticeable. He's fairly quick up to the second level, and he plays with some bend to his game. He can really bend, play with a lower pad level, nice angles on the backside of runs to seal off blocks. And he plays with some looseness in his hips. But again, to me, some of the lateral speed lacks a little bit when you see him on wide zone spots. He also can struggle to stay square. Isn't overly powerful. I didn't think the way that he was able to convert power was incredibly noticeable, and he was a little bit slow to find anchors. To me, he gave up too much ground in pass sets, and to me, his early hand placement would be an issue on top of that as well. So Shaq Mason wasn't great, I think, this past season, but he played at an average level. I think against us specifically, we got to see that. He's capable at guard. He's not someone that I think you're looking for, he could take us to the next level. But at this point, you'd look at him as more so, I think, as an average backup. But at this point, the Lions could look to add that kind of depth. I don't know that Shaq Mason is going to stand out to them as much at 31 years old at this point, but it is a reasonable option they could look at. A guy like Dalton Risner is still capable of starting to me. Now, again, some limitations here, and mainly that's as a blocker. He doesn't just impact the game that much as a blocker. However, he has been effective as a pass protection piece for sure, and we even saw that against us. Now, this past year, he's had to deal with a lot of injuries, which is another issue. But at 29 years old, he was dealing with a back injury early in the year, came back, and he was an effective pass protector specifically when he came back this past year and helped the Minnesota Vikings this past year. And now he's still out there as a free agent. To me, he's got some real flexion to open up his hips, to open up, be a little bit more rangy as an interior offensive lineman. He, again, is very likely going to settle into a guard spot, more so at that right guard spot, I would assume. But he can redirect. He can find late rushers, can find stunts. He also has, to me, a little bit of contact balance to his game. He keeps his feet on the ground pretty well, shows some contact balance because of that, has a little bit of knee bend in pass protection, which helps him a little bit. I think that's at an average level, but he's got a strong early base, which allows him to be effective early in pass set, eyes to be active in pass protection as well and give some support. I think he's got them redirect balance. That's where he tends to shine within his game, is some of the balance that he can plays with. But to me, he plays a little bit more of an upright style. You don't feel movement when he works like combo block specifically, so you don't feel him as kind of like a dry blocker, someone that can push people around. You just don't feel that. He also gets caught reaching. Body control for zone blocking. He just feels a little bit top heavy, which tends to get him pushed around a little bit more as well. His run game impact just isn't there for something the Lions would love. But from a pass protection standpoint, you do get some consistency within his game, which is nice. And again, he would dial in to more so of that right guard spot. I do think that he's a capable starter. He's not a dynamic game changer, but he's a capable starter that gives you a little bit more in pass protection than you would typically get. So that's Dalton Risner, who's still available on the market. I'll talk a little bit about Jack Driscoll, but let me go to a young guy here. Let me go to a couple young guys, and these two young guys are really interesting to me. The first one I'm going to go to is Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson was waived by the Dallas Cowboys. Last season, he spent his preseason with the Carolina Panthers. He was waived recently by the Dallas Cowboys, but at 26 years old, really the only time we've seen him is at guard. We see him at left guard for Carolina, rocking that number 67, and he was a guy that really caught my eye. As someone that is more so of, okay, there's some development here as a former 7th-round pick, that play tackle, moving him into guard, that's kind of his body type. It's fit to do that. So there's still some development that I think is on the table for him, and he could be signed to a very cheap contract, which would make sense for another body the Lions could throw into the mix, as we saw him in week 2 and week 3 of the preseason this past year. Because to me is a pretty easy mover with a guy that has really good size to fit in at guard. He doesn't look out of place as an interior offensive lineman. He's got a strong inside punch. He's got the knee bend, a little bit of force. He gets pretty square when he climbs up to the next level, and his backside quickness is good. I think that this is a pretty scheme versatile piece at the next level, and you just need to see more of his game. He caught my eye, as well as, of course, Nick Harris. Now, I tend to like, I think, Jack Anderson a little bit more, but Nick Harris is a guy that you'll settle into the center position a little bit more naturally. He's also played tackle as well recently, but he was actually traded back to Cleveland from Seattle this past year to add a little bit of depth behind a guy like Ethan Pocic as their center, and he did fill in at times for them. He's on the shorter side, but he's a pretty stocky build, which is kind of good, but he doesn't feel overly athletic, and a big problem to me there is recovery. I feel like I have real questions when I watch him about his ability to recover when he gets in bad spots, but he does play with this natural leverage. He also is a pretty active mover, doesn't feel overly powerful, but he's very active with his feet to try to add some strain to his game. He plays with a very consistent wide base. Again, the leverage taps into that active stomping feet, a strong grip, and really nice depth for pass sets that can quickly create depth if he needs to. He also has an early burst when he gets out into his run fits, which is nice as well. And he shows some ability to kind of settle himself in and play with body control as a blocker, and especially when he's getting out in space where he doesn't feel out of control that often. However, to me, again, the recovery is the biggest issue. I don't think that he's much of a people mover at all, and he tends to give way too much ground early in his pass sets. Gets pushed back, feels a little bit soft on entry, and also his hand placement tends to be pretty high. I think that Nick Harris is, again, another guy that you'd bring in is not high expectations, but someone that could potentially come in and compete, that maybe could surprise you as he continues to get better, but he feels like a center only. Though he's played different spots, I'd want him to live at center, which could be valuable for us as well. Go to a guy like Jack Driscoll, and Jack Driscoll, again, from Philly. We've actually talked about him before. His tackle and guard flexibility is noticeable. He's only 28 years old, and we mainly saw him just like we saw Nick Gates at the end of this past season, week 18 for Philly, when the game didn't matter for them against the Giants, and we saw his ability to be an easy mover, which makes sense as a tackle to guard, and he also showed really quick wins. He plays with great length, can lock guys out early, doesn't have to give up ground early. Someone that caught my eye back then. I think he's still an interesting, again, piece that you'd bring in more so on a minimum deal and just kind of see what could happen with that and what flexibility he could actually tap into and how much improvement you can actually get. Then you got guys like Will Hernandez, but Will Hernandez's injury is kind of the holdup for me there. He's coming off the torn ACL. I wonder if that's why Arizona hasn't brought him back yet and where he's at within that process, but he's one of the better guards available. He just has that, and he played an okay game against us this past year. We've talked about Will Hernandez, though. We've also talked about Brandon Sheriff in an early video, so that video is already up. You can definitely go check that out. I do believe the best option available in the market is from an interior offensive lineman just in general is Brandon Sheriff. I'd be absolutely down to sign him. But I think those are options of, guys that could be much more reasonable in terms of what the Lions would be willing to pay that could bring some upside. And then on the veteran side, an honorable mention that I want to throw in here was a guy like Dan Feeney. Dan Feeney at 31 years old. The last time we really saw him take snaps was 2023 in the regular season, but we did see him a little bit in the 2024 preseason at the guard position. He's someone that caught my eye a little bit as seeing some ability there. And then also a guy like Sam Mustipher, who is most recently with the LA Chargers at center in the preseason, ended up landing on their practice squad, got promoted during the season, and then recently he ended up signing with the Tennessee Titans about a month ago, but it looks like he's available now, so clearly that didn't last very long. Those are two honorable mentions that caught my eye slightly as some interesting, more minimum type of deals, but veteran type of pieces in the NFL. But ultimately, I think there's some solid options that Lions could go more of the youth route if they wanted to, and they just have to find a guy that fits their scheme. I think Nick Gates is incredibly intriguing because of that reason. Cody White here doesn't feel like he brings enough as a run blocker. I think Jack Driscoll continues to be interesting to me. I love the Jack Anderson idea as a guard. Nick Harris could be intriguing because you could plug him in at center and kind of leave him there, and he'd be pretty comfortable. And then you could go more the expensive route, which would be your Dalton Risners, your Brandon Sheriffs, potentially Raul Hernandez. And then you got a guy like Shaq Mason, who is clearly a guard, and I think he brings some flexibility to what you can ask him to do stylistically. He's just more so, to me, he's not going to change the game, but he brings a little bit more consistency. So I do think there's some interior offense line options. I don't know how many actually legitimate starting options there are still available, but that the Lions could go after. And this could mean the Lions not signing an offensive lineman. They could instead go the route of saying, hey, this is going to open up cap space for one, a guy like Zadarius Smith, which I think would be great. I didn't think was even realistic in the past, but now could maybe make it more realistic. Or two, that they wanted to just kind of continue to save this money, at least now, pushing it into next year. And then this gives them more flexibility into next year, which is incredibly valuable because the Lions have a lot of cap hits hitting in a big way next year, and they have a lot of extensions down the road that are going to be into play. So the more money they can save, the better, and I think that they'll lean into that. But I do ultimately think they're going to bring in somebody, and even if they didn't open up any cap space with Frank, I think they'd still bring in somebody to add some more competition back into that room, and I think that will happen. Now they just have made a little bit more flexibility in terms of money they can spend. I'm going to leave it there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Prop, for watching, and I'm out.